For 10,000 years, a single food has held more power over human destiny than kings, religions, or gold. It built the first cities. It created the first slave class. It sparked revolutions that toppled empires and famines that consumed millions. This food was not a luxury. It was bread, and its history is written in blood, sweat, and the quiet desperation of those who hungered for it. The modern illusion. Walk into any bakery today and the scent of fresh bread surrounds you like a warm embrace. Golden loaves line the shelves. Sourdough, ciabatta, whole wheat. Each one a simple pleasure, a comfort food that costs mere pennies. We slice it without thinking. We toast it, forget it, throw it away. Bread has become so ordinary, so abundant, that we've forgotten what it once was. But bread was never simple. Long before it became a staple of supermarket aisles, bread was power itself. It was currency. It was control. Civilizations rose and fell based on who owned the grain and who controlled the ovens. The origins of bread are inseparable from the origins of human inequality, organized labor, and systematic oppression. To understand the dark history of bread is to understand how a single agricultural innovation transformed free-roaming humans into subjects, peasants, and eventually slaves. This is not a story of culinary progress. This is a story of control. The first harvest, origins in ancient civilizations. 12,000 years ago, humans lived as nomads. They followed herds across vast landscapes, gathered wild plants, and moved with the seasons. There were no borders, no landlords, no taxes. Then something changed in the Fertile Crescent, a region stretching across modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Ancient grain cultivation began not as an act of convenience, but as an act that would fundamentally alter the human condition. Archaeological evidence shows that humans first domesticated wild wheat and barley around 10,000 BCE. These early grains, emmer, einkorn, and primitive barley, required labor. They demanded tending, harvesting, processing. The kernels had to be threshed, winnowed, ground into flour. Unlike fruits or tubers that could be eaten raw, these grains needed transformation. They needed fire. They needed bread. The earliest bread was nothing like what we know today. It was a flat bread, dense and coarse, baked on hot stones or in primitive clay ovens. But this simple food had a revolutionary quality. It could be stored. Unlike meat that spoiled or vegetables that rotted, grain could be kept for months, even years. This was the beginning of surplus, and surplus changed everything. When humans learned to store grain, they stopped moving. Permanent settlements appeared along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Villages grew into towns. Towns grew into cities. But with permanence came a new problem. Who would control the grain storage and control the distribution of this life-sustaining food? The answer would shape human societies forever. The architecture of control, bread and civilization. In ancient Mesopotamia, the first granaries were not communal stores. They were temples. Priests controlled the grain, and through grain, they controlled the people. The earliest written records, cuneiform tablets from Uruk dating to 3400 BCE, are not epic poems or philosophical treatises. They are accounting ledgers, lists of grain distributed, lists of bread rations, lists of labor hours owed. Bread in ancient civilizations became the foundation of the first bureaucratic states. In Sumer, workers were paid not in money, but in rations, measured amounts of barley and bread distributed according to social rank. A laborer received 2 liters of barley per day. A woman received 1 liter, a child, half a liter. This was not generosity. This was a system of dependency. Without access to grain, people could not eat. Without bread, they could not survive. And so they worked. They built ziggurats, dug irrigation channels, hauled limestone blocks under the burning sun. The history of bread is inseparable from the history of forced labor because bread became the chain that bound workers to their masters. Ancient Egypt perfected this system. The pyramids, Those monuments to divine kingship were not built by slaves in the traditional sense, but by workers who labored for bread. Thousands of men lived in workers' villages near Giza, receiving daily rations of bread and beer in exchange for their toil. Bakeries operated day and night, producing hundreds of loaves. The grain came from the Nile Delta, controlled by the pharaoh's administrators, stored in massive state granaries. To control the bread was to control Egypt itself. But there was a darker truth beneath this system. The grain storage and control mechanisms required constant expansion. More grain meant more workers. More workers meant more grain needed. Egypt became an empire not through military conquest alone, but through agricultural imperialism, seizing fertile lands, extracting tribute in wheat and barley, funneling it all back to the granaries of the state. Those who resisted starved. The grain throne, how bread built empires. Rome understood this better than any civilization before it. The Roman Empire was not held together by legions alone, it was held together by bread. Panem et circenses, the poet Juvenal wrote, bread and circuses. Give the masses food and entertainment, and they will not revolt. At its height, Rome imported hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat annually from Egypt and North Africa. This grain flowed into the city through a vast logistics network, merchant ships crossing the Mediterranean, river barges navigating the Tiber, distribution centers coordinating deliveries. The state provided free bread to nearly 200,000 Roman citizens through a grain dole system that became the lifeblood of political power. Emperors who ensured the bread supply were beloved. Emperors who failed faced riots. In 190 CE, when grain shipments were delayed, mobs nearly tore Emperor Commodus from his throne. The message was clear: control the bread or lose the empire. But this system had a hidden cost. The origins of bread as a political tool created a society dependent on distant provinces for survival. When those provinces rebelled, when Egypt or North Africa withheld their harvests, Rome starved. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century was not caused by barbarian invasions alone. It was accelerated by the collapse of its grain supply networks. Bread built Rome. The loss of bread destroyed it. Yet the system did not die with Rome. Medieval Europe inherited the same fundamental truth. Whoever controlled the grain controlled the people. Feudal lords owned the grain fields. Peasants worked those fields, giving much of their harvest to the lord in exchange for protection. But there was another layer of control: the mill and the oven. In most European villages, lords held the monopoly on milling grain and baking bread. Peasants were forbidden from grinding their own flour or baking their own loaves. They had to pay fees to use the lord's mill and the lord's oven. This was not convenience. This was extraction. Even the most basic human need, transforming grain into edible food, became a source of profit and power. Those who defied these monopolies faced punishment. In medieval France, peasants caught baking bread in secret ovens were fined, imprisoned, or worse. Hunger as weapon, the dark side of bread. But the darkest chapters of bread's history are written in famine. Throughout human civilization, bread has been weaponized. He who controls the grain can feed his people, or starve his enemies. Ancient siege warfare understood this. Surround a city, cut off its grain supply, and wait. Starvation would do what armies could not. In 1315, across northern Europe, the rains came and would not stop. Crops rotted in the fields. Grain stores molded and spoiled. The Great Famine consumed the continent for 7 years. Millions died. Chronicles describe parents abandoning children, the poor eating dogs and cats, desperate people grinding tree bark into a substance they called bread. The social order collapsed. Crime exploded. Villages were abandoned. This was not a natural disaster alone. It was a systemic failure of a civilization that had become entirely dependent on grain and bread for survival. Diversification had been abandoned. Society had placed all its faith in wheat and barley, and when those crops failed, there was nothing left. The pattern repeated across centuries. In 1789, bread shortages helped ignite the French Revolution. Poor harvests drove up prices. Bakers hoarded grain. Mobs stormed bakeries, dragging owners into the streets. "Let them eat cake," Marie Antoinette allegedly said, a phrase that became a symbol of aristocratic indifference. Whether she spoke those words or not, the fury was real. Bread riots became the spark that burned down the Bourbon monarchy. 20th century tyrants learned the same lesson. In Soviet Ukraine during the 1930s, Stalin seized grain from peasant farmers, shipping it to cities and selling it abroad while millions starved in the Holodomor. Food and power were inseparable. To control bread was to control life itself. Even today, nations understand this ancient truth. Countries that cannot feed themselves are vulnerable. Food security is national security. The history of food, and particularly the history of grain and bread, is a history of vulnerability disguised as civilization. The transformation from sacred to industrial. Yet, bread's meaning has shifted across millennia. In ancient Egypt, bread was sacred, offered to gods, placed in tombs to nourish the dead in the afterlife. In Christianity, bread became flesh, the body of Christ, a symbol of divine sacrifice. "Give us this day our daily bread" was not merely a prayer for sustenance, but an acknowledgement of bread's essential place in survival. For most of human history, making bread was labor. Grain had to be harvested, threshed, winnowed, ground, kneaded, shaped, and baked. A single loaf represented hours of work. Women, who did most of this labor, spent entire days producing bread for their families. It was backbreaking, necessary, and endless. The Industrial Revolution changed this. Mechanized mills replaced hand grinding. Commercial bakeries replaced home ovens. By the 19th century, bread production moved from households to factories. The Chorleywood process, developed in 1961, allowed bread to be made in hours instead of days, using chemical additives and high-speed mixing. Bread became cheap, uniform, and ubiquitous. But something was lost. Bread stopped being a connection to the earth, to labor, to time. It became a commodity, something purchased without thought, consumed without reverence, discarded without guilt. The dark history of bread had come full circle. What began as a tool of control became so abundant that it lost its power. Yet the structures it created, social hierarchies, labor systems, state bureaucracies, remain embedded in our world. The invisible chains. Why bread still shapes us. Walk through a modern supermarket and count the products derived from grain. Bread, pasta, cereals, crackers, cakes, cookies, beer, the descendants of that first domesticated wheat. Our entire food system is still built on the same foundation laid down 10,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. We think we have escaped the ancient patterns. We believe our abundance makes us free. But consider this. Most humans still live in societies where access to grain determines survival. Global wheat prices affect billions. When harvests fail in Ukraine or Russia, food riots erupt in Egypt and Tunisia. The same mechanisms of control operate, hidden beneath layers of modern economics and international trade. The systems of grain storage and control have simply grown more sophisticated. Today, a handful of corporations manage global grain supplies. Futures markets determine prices. Governments stockpile wheat as strategic reserves. The power has shifted from pharaohs and emperors to executives and ministers, but the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Control the bread, control the people. Even in wealthy nations, bread retains symbolic power. Political campaigns still invoke it. Bread and butter issues, the concerns of ordinary people. When we speak of earning our daily bread, we echo prayers and anxieties thousands of years old. The history of bread reveals an uncomfortable truth about civilization itself. Progress, complexity, and culture came at a cost. We traded nomadic freedom for agricultural security, and that security required hierarchy, labor, and control. Cities could not exist without grain stores. Empires could not function without bread distribution systems. The great achievements of human civilization, writing, mathematics, architecture, art, were all made possible by agricultural surplus, and that surplus was built on bread. But it was also built on inequality, dependency, and the systematic control of the most basic human need, food, the legacy that remains. Stand in a field of wheat, and you are standing in the cradle of civilization. Those golden stalks are the same species humans first cultivated in ancient Mesopotamia, only refined through millennia of selection. The grain that built the first cities, fed the first armies, and enriched the first kings still grows in vast monocultures across every inhabited continent. The dark history of bread is not a story with a clear ending. It is an ongoing pattern woven into the fabric of how we organize societies, distribute resources, and determine who eats and who goes hungry. Every loaf contains within it 10,000 years of human ambition, innovation, exploitation, and survival. We have forgotten what bread once meant. We have forgotten the power it held. But forgetting does not erase the legacy. The structures built around grain and bread still shape our world, in land ownership patterns, in labor systems, in global trade networks, in political power. Bread is not simple. It has never been simple. It is the food that made us civilized, and in becoming civilized, we built cages we still live in today. The granaries have become corporations. The ration lists have become paychecks. The mills and ovens are now industrial complexes. But the fundamental exchange remains the same. Work and you will eat. Obey and you will receive your bread. This is the hidden truth behind the most ordinary food in the world. This is the legacy written in grain and baked into every loaf. This is the dark history of bread. The history of how a simple food controlled civilizations and how, in many ways, it still does.